Hey there, folks. If you haven't heard, this is your warning. Update 11 is upon us, and it sounds like it's an update that, well, has a lot of bug fixes, but those aren't going to be talked about in here. Quality of life stuff, also not going to be talked in here. And the scuttlebutt is that some of the other changes, which are the subject of this video, uh, may end up shifting the meta away from armor and towards infantry and other things. So what I'm going to cover in this video is, first of all, what are the changes? And the changes come in a few categories: resources, the AT versus the tank and vehicle cat and mouse game, and additional changes to infantry loadouts. Then I'm going to talk about the implications of those changes, or the probable implications of those changes, and then undertake the perilous task of maybe making some predictions about how Update 11 will play out. All right, starting with resources, and what I think is probably the biggest, or maybe on par with the biggest changes when it comes to resources, has been the removal, at least the temporary removal, of the final stand commander ability. If you've never played commander or don't understand what that did, then this doesn't really make any sense to you. But in short, every 10 minutes, commanders would be able to spam this ability and generate all three resources for free, and that has been removed. So over the course of a long, grindy game, that's going to generate, it did generate a significant number of resources, and that is now gone. Second, this also hits on the kind of resources a bit. The encouraged ability is only going to provide additional resources by the nodes that are up, so they better be up. I guess as some sort of compensation for that, the resources that nodes produce begin generating a little bit quicker. You don't have to wait until 1 minute passes before they start adding to the pool. They'll start generating with the ambient regeneration clock in game. So I guess that tries to offset some of the other nerfs when it comes to resources coming in, but I don't think it does that. So in general, I would say, if you want to do a quick takeaway, it's there are going to be fewer resources. Last 2 points about resources, although it does bleed into the next topic of the anti-tank versus armor and vehicle, are the increased costs of resources, particularly when it comes to fuel cost for heavier tanks. Heavy tank fuel costs are going up by 50% in relative terms, from 400 fuel to 600, and for the Jumbo 75, it's going to be a 67% increase in relative costs, from 300 to 500 fuel. And lastly, on the resources side, I think because of the increased prevalence of AT guns, which I'm about to talk about, there could likely be an increase demand for munitions resources. And so if people thought that they could get, they could solve the fuel problem without the final stand commander ability by just trading in munitions or manpower for fuel, well, hold on a minute, that option may not be as fruitful as you think. Okay, the second area I'm going to cover here are the changes to anti-tank and armor and vehicles. I would say a reasonable takeaway from this is, at least at first glance, it appears that there are going to be fewer and more expensive heavy tanks, and at least some generally improved means of destroying armor and vehicles. So, what are the changes? Tanks on the heavier side are going to have their fuel costs raised considerably, and when you couple this with the elimination of the final stand commander ability, this is probably going to produce greater resource constraints in Update 11 than what we're used to in Update 10. On the we'll wait and see side of changes, the Panther has been replaced by the Panzer IV. All right, we'll see how that plays out. The Sherman 76 had its cooldown increased so that it's more similar to the other heavy tanks. Half tracks have been added to the game. I kind of feel with this one, it's like the Panzer IV. We'll see if this matters and how it matters as the stuff from the PTA PTE gets switched over to the general branches, and we have a lot more people play it. One of the bigger changes that I think is coming to the AT versus Armor cat and mouse game is that for the Americans and the Germans, their AT loadouts for level 3 and 6 have been swapped. So right now in update 10, level 3 AT loadout is going to give you the satchels and the AT mines, and the level 6 gives you the AT gun. Now they're swapping. Again, that's for the Germans and for the Americans. The kind of quick takeaway from that is that we should see a decrease in the prevalence of mines and satchels unless players are going to grind up to AT level 6. But we could also expect to see an increased prevalence of AT guns. While I'm on the topic of AT guns, I'll mention that their damage output has been increased so that it can now penetrate heavy armor. The next update from the AT realm, and this is one that's been reported from players who have played in the PTE, but it did not appear in the update log, is that the rumor is that one satchel no longer destroys a heavy tank. Again, I haven't been able to confirm it, but I have heard that multiple times from folks who have played on the PTE. So that kind of nerfs, if you can get a satchel, that ability to take out heavy tanks with them. However, on the plus side, the claim is that in update 11, the devs have fixed the bug where sometimes you put a satchel on a tank, it will detonate, and the tank takes no damage. And so now those kills actually should go through as kills. All right, that's that. Bombing runs will deal radial damage to the lightly armored parts of vehicles, and vehicles includes recon tank, tracked vehicles as well. And it's apparently going to be more difficult for those vehicles to avoid that radial damage unless they are almost completely in cover by other interposing objects on the battlefield. Bazookas and Panzerschrecks can also now deal radial damage to Shreks. All right, fine, whatever. And I'll put this in here as the last point on the kind of AT armor update, which is the apparent reduction in the damage output of the light tanks and the cutting in half of the damage output of the recon vehicle. Now that might seem like a nerf to armor, and okay, fine, but remember that sometimes those vehicles, if they get behind a medium or heavy tank and could get enough back shots in them, might be able to take them down. It will now be harder for that to happen, even if they get the jump on their heavier rival armor players. The last area of changes I'll touch on in this video for update 11 are the changes to some infantry loadouts. I think it's now pretty well known that the Americans are getting the trench gun, and they're getting it in 2 infantry classes. They're getting it at the Engineer Level 3 loadout and the U.S. Assault Level 3 loadout. The Assault class already has, I believe it's the most loadouts, or close to tied for the most loadouts, and so there's going to be some greater variation there. All right, fine. The U.S. Engineer Level 3 now has the trench gun, which is interesting, and I'll mention here also that there is a now Level 6 Engineer class, which they reference in the notes. It's the Field Engineer loadout at Level 6, and all the notes mention is that they gave it a hammer. Wasn't on the PTE, so I don't know what else is included in that. Time will tell. Additionally, the FG-42 has been added, and this is one for the Germans. It's kind of interesting because it's available in the non-scoped version for the German automatic riflemen at the Level 6 loadout. Up until now, I think unless you really are you're liking the automatic rifleman class, it's hard to justify a grind beyond Level 3 for that class. Now there's a reason to grind for it because the Germans are on every map. And so you have a reasonable chance of playing them, and maybe you want that. And it can now be prevalent because every infantry squad can have an assault rifleman person in it. So there you go. And the scoped FG-42 is going to be available to German snipers at level 3. So the implications of all of this, I think the biggest story remains a more resource-constrained environment, more important than the perceived nerfing of armor or heavy armor at the expense of AT guns. And I think the reason the devs are doing this is to incentivize folks who play the game to play even more tightly as a team. And many folks have complained in the past in all sorts of fora that, people are too many Rambos, too many lone wolves, whatever you want to call it, not enough team players. Believe it or not, it sounds like the devs, whether responding to that or their own designs, seems to have crafted Update 11 with an eye towards forcing tighter coordination among the parts. First, you ought to do the team stuff. You're going to most likely need a commander. Though I've been suggesting it anyways in Update 10, it seems even more important that you're going to have a support and an engineer person, or at least a person that does support and engineer. You're going to need those resource nodes up early, and you're going to need to keep them up. And I'd recommend that as a team, you bring at least one power node with you, either probably to your defensive hard cap or near it, so that the support players who are on defense can generate from the quicker supply. But that support role, which has been important, is going to be increasingly important. Squad leaders still need to build their Garys. The anti-tank players are going to want those supplies for their AT guns. Your commanders, who are going to have less plentiful resources than in the past, are probably going to have to be less willing to make supply drops when they can tell squad leads that get your support players to do it, or get somebody to hop on support and do it. And because of the resource constraints, engineers are going to be under pressure, rightfully, to build and to keep those nodes up. Never mind the fact that already commanders, AT, and RD also want resources for their own things, and then engineers want it beyond the nodes to construct other things that can help the team. I'd also add that level 3 ammo carrier role is important for AT players who aren't going to have access to satchels and mines until they get to the level 6 loadout. When they're mobile, that is not using an AT gun, that means they're going to be using the rocket-propelled stuff, which, hopefully some of the ricochet stuff has been fixed. I'm not sure we'll see that, but sometimes 2 rockets ain't enough to get the job done, and so that explosive ammo refill will certainly help them do more damage. I'd also predict that some of these changes are going to force more inter or intra squad cooperation, as support players are going to be called on to pool their resources, say to build red zone Garys, because commanders may not have the resources to drop them. So 2 squads are going to have to get support players down, or 1 squad is going to have to get 2 people to cycle through support to get those supplies down for red zone Garys, to drop supplies for other squads, AT folks to build their AT gun, and for engineers to get their nodes, tank repair stations, all the other things. So a lot of times we kind of get siloed into our squads at best, but this might actually be pushing for some squads to cooperate more with each other. So attacking squads might go out in pairs rather than 1 or 2. We'll see. That can be very tricky to do based on the kind of random assignment of pub matches and hell let loose. One of the other kind of effects of these changes in Update 11 is that the downside to having more abundant AT guns is that they're competing with artillery and commander for the munitions resources. And I can tell you, doing a lot of artillery late in Update 10, even with nodes, it is not always plentiful. even with just me on the gun, it's not always that plentiful, and I try to be very careful not to spam it. And so, in a more resource constrained environment, if AT players are going ham and not effective with their shots or whatever, it's going to constrain the other parts of the force, which might be better at, say, killing infantry. Give that to artillery to do rather than having AT guns spam shots into the other side. So actually, spoilers or trolls, whatever you might want to call them, might actually run a side out of munitions. That's something that I hope won't happen. We'll see. One of the other implications of the purported changes in Update 11 is that I think it incentivizes teams to begin focusing more on attacking the other side's resource base and to punish them for inefficiently using their scarce resources. Uh, I'll do a little bit of griping. I think it takes way too long to take down resource nodes in Update 10. I don't think it's been changed in Update 11, but at least knowing that the other side is more resource constrained in several respects or for several reasons, I might be more likely to actually sit down and take down a node or two. But right now in Update 10, a lot of folks just bypass them. They focus on knocking out the Garys, the OPs, the troops, and then capturing the sector and taking any kind of forward build nodes down that way. But now you might actually have folks who are going to spend the time to go after those nodes because resources are going to be more scarce. All right, the next possible implication of the changes I talked about earlier is to encourage greater cooperation between armor and other parts of the team to keep those expensive tanks alive, and also making the outcomes of those armor duels more consequential. I'm not saying that it will happen, and I'm also not saying that it doesn't happen. It does, but I think it's going to incentivize that it happen even more. And call me crazy, but with the new fuel costs on these tanks and the increased cooldown, at least to the American, I think it was the Jumbo 75, that engineer role, building tank repair stations and repairing tanks, looks much better to me than it did before. And that engineer role can still place AT mines, I believe, at a very low level, something that the AT player is now not going to get until level 6. Hey, I'm just saying, it's the engineer. All right, second to last kind of implication of the changes that have been reported is that it seems the devs are pushing folks to use the assets in the game that are more applicable to their intended role. And I'm really talking about the recon tank. I don't think it was the purpose of the devs to make a recon tank that was a kind of dollar store tank hunter. It's a recon tank. Its job is to do reconnaissance, and it has, I believe, a 5-person carrying capacity, so beyond the crew. And it's a capacity that seems incredibly underutilized to me, and it's still going to have enough firepower and speed to wreck unprotected infantry that it happens to find. It could see an increased role in waging that economic warfare that I mentioned. If they find a cluster of resource nodes and the tank has enough folks in it, they can empty out, take down those nodes simultaneously, get back in it, and leave before the other side is kind of wise as to what happens. All right, the final kind of, I think, somewhat obvious implication of the changes is that the devs are continuing to push the game towards what they call either symmetrical asymmetry or asymmetric symmetry, whatever it is. But it seems that with the changes in loadouts and weapons that were introduced in Update 11, that Germany is going to do better at range. It already has the MG42 for the level 3 loadout for machine gunner. Its level 6 rifleman already gets the explosive ammo box. But now the level 6 assault rifleman and the level 3 sniper seem to generally push Germany into a more favorable exchange at range, whereas for the United States, the acquisition of the trench gun gives it new capabilities in shorter range contests, which tend to be quite prevalent in Hell Let Loose. So one implication of this might be that the USA will rely on armor, smoke produced from a variety of sources, and artillery, as well as bombing runs, to try to deal with threats at range and to try to close the gap on the Germans, and then try to win at closer range. That's still going to be difficult given the prevalence of MP40s and the capacity to get STGs for the Germans. They're still going to give them a very good chance at close range. But that might be how that trade-off plays out in practice. All right, so as we round out things, the title of the video was this question about whether there was a meta shift. So in order to talk about a shift from 10 to 11, we got to understand what 10 was. Personally, I like 10 better than 9. In 9, if you got pushed back in warfare, 1 to 4, it was very difficult to get counterattacks going against attackers who kind of just did an adequate job because of the different resource generation potentials between the two sides. In Update 10, I've come back from, and I've lost to, being up or down 4-1. And so I think being awash in resources is one of the things that contributed to that. And I think that makes for a more interesting game rather than just being down and just kind of waiting for the clock to run out. So I thought that was good about Update 10. Despite generally being awash in resources, nodes would at least eventually go up. On the attack, as I mentioned earlier, many folks just kind of ignored nodes because they took too long and they were easy to put up. And even if you did take them down, it was assumed that the other side was probably going to have enough resources to do fine anyways. And the last thing I'll say about Update 10 is that I played against a lot of armor as infantry, including quite a good deal of time as anti-tank infantry. And I can tell you that quality armor in Update 10 made its presence felt, but it could still be offset by very good AT play or quality allied armor play. It could also be undone by other things, but it never felt like one of the reasons why the enemy armor was limited in its capacity was because of too few resources. While tankers understandably complained about satchel spam in Update 10, I can tell you from the AT infantry's perspective, we were not much happier when we'd finally satchel a tank down, and then 2 minutes later, another heavy medium tank comes rolling up the road. It's like, what was all that for? So, anyways, those are kind of my thoughts on Update 10. So far as the armor versus AT debate goes forward in Update 11, yeah, there are things that are working against armor I've already covered in the video. More and more powerful AT guns, the increased radial damage to the lightly armored parts for bombing runs, the increased fuel cost for heavier tanks in an environment in which there are just fewer resources overall, and the reduced damage output for lighter tanks. But I'll also use that as my transition to talk about the things that might look more favorable for armor, or at least some armor, going into Update 11, which is that the reduced damage output for lighter tanks might in some ways compensate the heavier, the medium tanks who might end up being engaged with them. There should be, all things being equal, fewer satchels, and if the rumors are true, less powerful satchels, at least against those now more expensive heavy tanks. By swapping the AT loadouts for level 3 and 6 for Germany and the United States, we should see fewer AT mines. And for tankers who win their 1v1s against other tanks, I think that those wins should feel more consequential because the resources to generate those tanks are more important. Keeping tanks alive, as I mentioned when I was talking about the engineer, also seems like if we're going to make an investment and we have fewer resources to invest, you're going to incentivize people to doing those kind of helper roles that engineers and others can play. I think there are also some neutral aspects, and even though I'll put them down as neutral aspects because they're pretty much symmetrical, I think that they're kind of positive for armor. First of all, while your side is resource constrained, so is the other side. Right? They're operating under the same conditions. And however good or bad, prevalent, OP, or whatever AT guns are, Remember that your side also has those AT guns to be used against the other side's armor and AT. And I would just close that point by observing that already AT guns are quite powerful. I understand that now they can penetrate heavy armor, and so that is new and different. But against a lot of the lower armored variations already, they're already doing some good work. I would also conclude this kind of AT versus tank thing and wrap things up here by pointing out that there are a number of downsides for AT guns, which is that they may just start getting sniped by other AT guns, which I don't know how that's going to affect the meta, but that's a real possibility. Stationary AT guns, once located, are pretty ripe targets for enemy artillery to pound. It gives recon, attack squads, recon vehicles, all that stuff, something new to harass. And if players are going to sit on AT guns and have one or two on that means that they're not with the rest of the squad, whether attacking or defending as they're supposed to be. And it might be easier to pick off isolated parts of a unit. And in the worst case scenario for tankers, which is that, AT guns are so good and so prevalent, all this other stuff, then that just means that people are going to play armor less, in which case the entire point of making the AT gun more prevalent and powerful is kind of defeated, because the targets tend to be then infantry. And for that, you should be using HE and other things that you're not going to get with the AT gun. So my view of Update 11 before it goes out is that it seems like the devs are trying to force teams to play more like, teams. The teams that have more of those players who are willing to pitch in and sacrifice for the good of the team. And I think that goes for both building up resources and then taking down the other side's resources, should have a leg up on those who neglect to do those things. And teams who cooperate on resource sharing should run smoother than teams full of people who want to spam RD or AT guns or whatever just to pad those scores. I think all those things are welcome additions, especially as the game inches towards linking the resources conserved in one map to the next, kind of get that chapter playthrough. Whether Update 11 actually plays out as I think it was intended is a different and a really important issue, but it's one that we're only going to see once the update goes live and we've had some time to play through it. So that is it for this overview. I encourage you to go in there, and I hope to see you in there when I join you.